You are listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 290.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. How's everybody doing today? I hope you're all doing well, and I am excited to be here with another interview with a traditionally published cookbook author. But before we get started, I would like to give a shout out to everyone who joined Cookbooks on KDP for our 2024 group program. We started this week, and it's so fun to meet all the people in the group who want to learn how to publish their recipes in a cookbook on Amazon. We have a lot of great members in the group, recipe collectors, amazing cooks, people who are truly interested in sharing their recipes with other people. So if you missed joining the program this year, please head on over to www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/KDP and hop on the wait list so you can be sure to be informed the next time we open the doors. There is also a link below in the show notes. So if you, again, want to learn how to publish your recipes in a book on Amazon, join the wait list for the next time we open the doors to Cookbooks on KDP. Today on the podcast, I have an interview with Tara Lanich-LaBrie. Growing up near Chicago and later studying in Santa Fe, Tara's culinary style has been deeply influenced by her appreciation for nature and art. Inside her company called The Medicine Circle, Tara combines her passion for plant-based inspired cooking and natural remedies. Today on the podcast, Tara and I take a magical culinary adventure inside her new book, Foraged and Grown, and we talk all about seasonal plants that inspire cooking, the use of natural color in food, and Tara's tips for introducing new plants and herbs into our diet. So without further delay, let's dive into this interview with Tara. Hi, Tara. Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast.
Thank you. Hi.
So excited that you're here. Can't wait to hear about your new book. But before we dive in, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm an author now.
Yay!
Yes. And I develop recipes and I cook, I forage, and I grow food as well.
Yes. And prior to writing a book, you had something called the Medicine Circle. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that and the community that you built pre-book?
Yeah, so the Medicine Circle is a community online that I built, really starting out with the intention of just creating a bridge between the natural world and everyone out in the world and bringing people more into the plants, into food, connecting to the earth, connecting back to themselves in a time when we've really become more isolated in a lot of ways, and particularly during the pandemic, really saw that, obviously, isolation and desire to learn how to grow food, how to cook food, how to forage food, and that's really where things took off.
Yeah. So how did you get into the plants and herbs and cooking with herbs and this natural world?
I mean, I always had a love of the natural world from the time I was very young, and I also had a love of food, and I spent a lot of time cooking as a child and a lot of time outdoors. And then after high school, I actually enrolled in a program to study to be a naturalist. So I started learning botany and ecology and courses like that. And a lot of my classes were outside, and I had an ecology teacher that one day took me out into the field and said, "Hey, go harvest that huge mushroom." It was a puffball mushroom, which is it can become very large, almost the size of like a volleyball. This was in Illinois. Um, and it's kind of a solid white ball mushroom that you can eat. And she had me harvest it. We cut it up and the whole class was there, and we cut it up in in the back of her pickup truck and fried it in a little pan with butter. And, it just was a life-changing moment. I had never eaten anything wild. I had never even considered that. But I loved botany. I loved ecology. I loved all of those things, but I had never known that you could just like eat a mushroom that was
Yeah.
growing. And you shouldn't eat just any mushroom, I should say. Of course, we don't just like go out and pick any mushroom we find, but this was a very obvious edible mushroom, and that kind of started the journey for me. And then I became very interested in like traditional herbal practices, bringing in more herbs into my diet, and yeah, just was so curious after that moment. What else is edible that's growing all around us,
Yeah.
and learning about dandelions and rose. I'd use rose water in cooking, but I kind of didn't like it.
Mhm.
and and then to actually incorporate rose petals was such a different experience. It wasn't that like fake floral punch. It was, oh, this is like an astringent, cooling, beautiful, delicious taste. So yeah, just kind of exploring a whole new world of flavor.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's so neat about this is, plant-based food is such a, buzz thing right now, buzzword, a lot of health benefits to it. But your book and your new book, just
Mm.
published this month, Foraged and Grown, really takes this concept to a different level because the focus is on herbs and uh, plants that you can forage for
Yeah.
outside. So why don't we dive into the book a little bit? Tell everybody what the book's about, what's in the book, and then we'll talk specifically about the seasonality of your book and how that applies to the kinds of things that we can use in the herb space and for forage food.
Sure. The book is really about connecting to the natural world and connecting to ourselves, and then connecting to food as well. And you know, there I don't want it to throw people off. Like, you don't have to be a forager or an herbalist to like this book. You don't have to be plant-based. It's really just um, kind of an invitation to explore some of those things. But then part of what I did for the whole book was create simple swaps, substitutions for people to, you know, okay, replace this with this. You don't need to have foraged ingredients. You can, just try out this recipe. And then, if you do start taking an interest in foraging, which I hope you do because it's really fun, um, even in your own backyard, or even, you know, um, in a local close by natural area, there could be roses, things like that. It's really to create a bridge to this other world. It's really to just invite people into the world of plants. And that's part of my use of color and things like that in the book, is also because I'm trying to like invite people into the moment of the plant. So say you know, a nettle donut, uh, first of all, a donut in itself is kind of this like fun and nostalgic shape or form of food. And so then I throw in some nettles and I make it blue, and um, and make it really bright green. Then that's the experience of harvesting a nettle. So for me, color and working with the plants in that way is just to kind of bring people all the way into the experience of a plant.
Yeah, and it looks like in the seasonal part of your book, like spring, I see the pages are actually divided with some colors on the edge. So I see the color purple or lavender. Why don't we talk about that color related to spring and how that color was chosen for that particular season? What plant was involved in that?
Definitely, that would have been lilacs. And lilacs have been a huge influence. I mean, I think probably the second page, I have the book right here. Yeah, I think the second page is lilac ice cream, which is one of my favorite things to make. And I started adding lilacs into different foods and recipes years ago when I started a farm, and I would have it as part of the offering for the farm. We would do like a CSA, which is little bags of food every week. Not little, it was pretty big bags
That's
of food.
usually a lot, right? A lot of food.
Lots of vegetables
Yeah,
and fruit.
right. That's great
Yeah.
though.
And I would prepare, things in my kitchen and include those as well. And lilac jelly was one of the things that I would make. And yeah, just lilacs are a huge inspiration. The I love the ephemeral quality of the spring flowers, and also lilacs themselves they don't really impart a strong flavor to food, but it's more like the essence of the flower. So it's for me when I'm using lilacs, um it's just infusing it with the lilac, and sometimes you get the scent, especially when you're making something like ice cream, because the fat can hold on to, um, the scent a little better.
Yeah. So if someone has a lilac bush in their yard,
Mhm.
walk them through the process of maybe how they would harvest the lilac and how they would use it in making the ice cream recipe.
Yeah, so first of all, for any flower that you're harvesting, any edible flower, you want to harvest as early in the morning as possible because the flowers are holding the most moisture early in the morning, and that actually gives them the strongest scent. And in herbalism, that's also when it has like the strongest medicine is how people would talk about it too. But that's when they have that really strong scent. That's why if you go out early in the morning, the pollinators are all buzzing around the flowers and they're all excited because it's drawing them in. So harvest early in the morning. And for lilacs, in order for them to not be bitter, it's a bit of a process of removing that green bottom part. And so you want to take the green bottom off um, and then just throw them into your milk. And yeah, and if you're using dairy, this book doesn't have any dairy in it, but if you wanted to make it with dairy to replace, then you would just put it into your cream or dairy substitute there.
Yeah. And the lilac ice cream and the lilac ice pops, both a beautiful shade of purple. And that's
Yes.
one thing you love is the color of the food in this book. It's not just I mean, you all will have to get the book to see it, but the colors are very intense. It's very incredible to see food that is that deeply and richly colored.
Thank you. Yeah, that is part of the idea for me is to and has been. I also teach classes frequently and have done dinners for people and things like that over the years, and used to host a weekly dinner where I could kind of get really creative and make all kinds of things. But um, it's it's really a part of bringing people into the experience of a plant. Like you said, why are these pages all purple? Well, we associate purple with lilacs, lavender, those kinds of things when we're thinking about plants. Like that's kind of a key part of it.
Yeah. So the next season then in the book is summer. And what do you associate with summer?
Oh, summer. Oh gosh, I mean, summer is everything, especially where I live in Colorado.
Yeah.
We have a farm here, and so summer is every single thing. It's cucumbers, it's all the wild foods, it's the wild mushrooms, it's tomatoes, it's all the flowers are in bloom. It's really the time of blooming and growing and nonstop preserving, nonstop harvesting. Yeah, it's it's really a rainbow in the summer.
So if a couple things that stick out as I look through summer, roses
Yes.
or nettle.
Oh, yes.
So when people are harvesting those, what would you recommend?
Oh, well, for nettles, and actually for roses, because roses, most of them have thorns. Um, you want to have a nice thick pair of gloves. For nettles, I harvest them without gloves, but I also use them to like relieve pain. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for people because they do sting and they can be extremely painful for people and give you like a kind of like a little nettle rash. So you want to have like leather gloves, but as soon as you heat them, even 2 minutes in boiling water, or baked, like I do in a lot of these recipes, they don't sting at all. It's completely gone. So, and also drying them for teas, drying them for powders, that's something that I do frequently. You'll see nettle powder in the pantry section in the back. It's it's one of the most nutritious plants that we have access to, and it's also just happens to be a weed, or classified as a weed, so it's great because we can harvest to our heart's content and, you know, not be taking something that's like a very rare plant or yeah.
Yeah. And the color in this chapter, this deep green, are
Yeah.
you getting that from the nettles themselves?
No, so nettles do contain chlorophyll, but I use a chlorophyll extract, and that is actually like it's in the list of ingredients like that I have in the front for what you would want to build your culinary herbalist pantry and our culinary herbalist kitchen. But yeah, it's a concentrated chlorophyll extract. So it's often coming from nettles. It might be coming from alfalfa even, and it's just a really bright green, and that's part of the color that I associate with that bright green nettle harvest. So that's another part of bringing people into the plant is, um, try this amazing nettle gnocchi that's bright green, just like it is when you harvest that plant.
Yeah. And so what are the advantages or why would we want to add the color? What do you believe it brings to the experience?
Um, I mean, I think that we eat with our eyes first. I mean, I think that that's a huge part of it. And for me, I love color. Just I love colorful food and colorful artwork. I love colorful everything. But I think the way that so basically how I see it is if I'm giving someone a food and saying, "Hey, this has roses in it," but they're tasting the rose, they might smell it, but I want the full sensory experience. I want them to know for sure this is a rose cookie. The cookie is made of a rose. Like this is a rose petal in your hand. And because I think it's kind of like putting in like a marker and like a little like a note in your brain like, "Oh, yeah, remember that I had that rose cookie?" And then maybe, months from now, you're like, "Oh, look at that rose," and something draws you to it, and maybe you wanna try it yourself, and yeah, so it's just another way to invite people into the plant world.
Yeah. And if someone is going to use their roses from their yard or they have a place where they can get them, what do you recommend for harvesting those?
Well, so roses, I harvest both as the flower in bloom, and then also I harvest the rose hips in the fall, and both are in the book. But for harvesting the petals, it's the same as lilacs. You want to harvest in the morning, and that's when they have the strongest scent. And then I often dry my rose petals. There are a couple recipes that I use fresh rose petals for because it's just really fun, and maybe I have an abundance in that late spring, early summer point. And then I dry the rose petals. I might grind them into rose petal powder with a coffee grinder or herb grinder. And I also make honeys with them. I make rose petal syrup. That's a really, really fun one. And I freeze it in little, ball jars and use it all winter. And it has a beautiful color. If you have red roses, it makes the most beautiful syrup. And people love it. You can pour it on ice cream. Yeah, it's just an amazing thing to have on hand.
Yeah. How do we know? Could we get roses like from the grocery store and use them, or are they recommending that we get them from a certain place?
I mean, the only time I would do that is if you knew for sure that they weren't sprayed, and a lot of nurseries do spray them to keep them fresh and beautiful looking. So I wouldn't necessarily just buy them from the store unless it explicitly says not sprayed, that I wouldn't. But
Yeah. You mentioned a CSA, the community supported agriculture, people getting a share of produce every
oh,
week from a farm. But I've heard of flower CSAs too, and or at a farmer's market, there's a flower vendor perhaps. Uh,
absolutely.
I think talking to them, seeing if they have roses or non-sprayed flowers, which I kind of guess they probably would.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, and
Yeah, there's so many amazing options at the farmers markets now. Yeah, it's incredible. And also our neighbors are great sources. Like a lot of times people are fine, I at different points we haven't had access to a farm or something like that. And um, I'll ask the neighbors, "Oh, can I come over and harvest your dandelions?" And they're like, "Great, we want to do that. We don't want them in our yard anyway." And and then usually people get interested or they're like, "Oh, what are you making?" Or and then you share a little bit with them, and it's a great way to kind of engage with neighbors, and also most of the time people aren't necessarily spraying their roses in their backyard, not
yeah,
necessarily. So it's a great
yeah.
option too.
Yeah, what a great way to get to talk to your neighbors about some
Yeah.
flowers and fun things you can do in the kitchen with them.
Yeah, exactly. Like, "I'll
Yep,
bring you some syrup."
exactly. You can say, "I'll borrow the flower and bring you something as a result." So what
Yes.
about let's talk about fall. When you think about the things from your herbs, foraging, what do you think of when you think of fall?
Well, actually, I do think of rose hips. And I also think of that's kind of the root season. So we move into dandelion roots, which are one of my favorite plants to harvest in the fall. It's all of after the flowers die back and kind of the energy of the plant retreats into the roots. You can harvest the root. It's very, very good for you. And then it also takes on the flavor of coffee. And so dandelion roots taste very, very much like coffee when you roast them. And I use them in lots of recipes. And it's kind of this like chocolatey, slightly bitter, um, really very coffee like flavor. And it's delicious, in addition to being just really good for you.
Yeah, those all
um,
sound great. What's it like to harvest the rose hips? Tell us a little bit about that process.
well, harvesting rose hips. So, rose hips, they became very, very popular in World War II, because they basically cured a lot of Europe of scurvy and vitamin C related deficiencies. So people were out harvesting rose hips all over because they're a very, very, very big source of vitamin C. So it's the perfect time to harvest them because we all need vitamin C. That's something we don't produce naturally in our bodies. So we all take, vitamin C going into the winter. So when you harvest a rose hip, you have to remove the seeds inside because they have fine little hairs on the seeds. And they're very irritating. And in fact, kids in World War II would often make like itching powder from the seeds of rose hips. It was like the first itching powder. um, and yeah, so you have to scrape the rose hip and it can be a tedious process. So actually, there are places online that you can buy the seeded rose hips. So if you don't want to make it yourself, or if you don't want to harvest them yourself, you can purchase seeded rose hips online. And there is sources in the book as well where you can buy things like that, dried. And I often powder them and add them into recipes like the drinking chocolate in the book. And it's a thickening, like the powder itself can thicken things up as well. It's got a lot of pectin. And so I add it to like jams and jellies, and it's just this great, like, kind of burst of fruity, red, almost citrusy flavor. And then you can also make like a cordial or an oxymel, which is a really delicious way to get vitamin C into your body too. With the whole rose hip, then you don't have to scrape out the seeds at all. You can just filter it through a mesh sieve.
Hmm, amazing. I think it's neat if people are able to buy some of these online if they want to try some of the recipes, but they don't have access in their own yard, or maybe they've passed the season, or their neighbors don't have any. It's just incredible to think that we have access to these ingredients. Uh,
Oh, yeah. So
yeah.
pretty much everyone in the book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing. So let's talk about winter. I see a lot of blue on the edge of these pages, and what comes to mind when you think of winter?
Oh, when I think of winter, I think of, warming things, baking, lots of creamy things. And I like to make lots of broths in the winter. And I start working a lot with things that I've preserved or dried. So I also, I'm looking at like the fennel and citrus salad. So citrus starts to come in winter. Even though I don't live in a place that has citrus, that's when like
Yeah.
the markets get just flooded with all the different kinds of citrus. So Meyer lemon preserve, you know, making a citrus and fennel and chicory salad with like roasted walnuts and things like that. That's really where I go to in the winter. I'm just in the kitchen. I like to bake and eat all the warming things.
Yeah. And you've mentioned some health properties and health benefits of a lot of these different herbs and plant, forage foods. What comes to mind when you think about our health and how this can benefit our health?
Well, I mean, I think that we can all benefit from adding more plants into our lives. So I try myself to just add as many as I can every day. Sometimes I'm successful and sometimes I'm eating pizza.
Yeah.
I think it's a balance. And I think the idea for this book, there's lots of recipes in here that you can make, and then, you just add it into your meal, or you have it on hand, but it's not something where you have to make this huge thing every day. So I try to make it as accessible as possible. I think the more accessible that things can be, the more likely we are to actually use it on a
Right.
regular basis. So yeah, I think just adding more and more plants into our diet is a great way to increase our health overall.
Yeah. And if someone is just starting, you mentioned some concepts of swapping different ingredients out in the recipe. So why don't you talk a little bit about that also?
Sure. An example would be nettles. Nettles are, very, I think they're much, much more delicious than spinach, but it's a great substitute. You can sub in spinach, and there's things, I talk about using plantain in, I call it the land dwellers seaweed salad, but you can just as easily substitute in kale for that. And it tastes great. And a lot of times I use kale because I don't have plantain growing,
Yeah.
but I still want that flavor and I still want that recipe. So, there's lots of things like that. With a lot of the flowers, you can either leave them out or you can substitute in a flower that is easily found, like roses, or calendula is another one that a lot of times you can find easily online in bulk, like dried calendula flower petals. And that's a great one to add in as well. And then substitutions with the culinary spices and herbs that you have in your kitchen already. Um, I use a lot of rosemary, thyme, things like that. Those are all things that we can just go into the cabinet and find usually.
Yeah. So that's great. I think it's nice to know that and to hear from you too that this isn't like an all or nothing proposition. This
No,
book has so many delicious recipes that don't have gluten. They're sweetened with natural alternatives, but certainly a lot of breadth to the kinds of swaps that you can make in using the foraged or grown herbs and uh, ingredients if you can find them or have access to them. But otherwise, there are other ways you can make the recipe. And I think that makes almost like double duty for some of these recipes, which is
yes.
really fun to think about. If you don't have the nettle, using, fresh spinach and diving into the recipe anyway and using the nettle when you can find it or have it.
Right, exactly. And yeah, there's also options. So if say that if you do use dairy, and you don't, want to use dairy-free butter or you don't want to use dairy-free milks, you can always just substitute that back in. If you don't want to use, coconut sugar, you can use cane sugar. So I don't want people to feel like um excluded from it. I want them to feel included in it.
Yep.
And it can just be as simple as that.
Yeah. Well, why don't you talked about your book, but what was it that led you to the cookbook from the work that you were doing prior to it? Tell us a little bit about your journey into the cookbook space.
Mm. Well, I have always loved cooking for people. So I should say I started cooking for my best friend, and I started cooking for his family once a week when we were 8 years old, which which wound up with a lot of really massive disasters, but we learned a lot. And we continued that after we graduated college together in Chicago, and that went on for 7 years. So we would have like 14 people every week and be cooking food and just kind of experimenting in that way. And then it really moved into, I started a subscription site. People were asking, oh, like, we want to learn from you and things like that, just because of social media. And so I started sharing cooking courses, how to make some of these things, because it was a little bit different. And from there, publishers just started asking, "Oh, would you like to make a cookbook about this? And would you like, And then I found an agent and kind of went from there.
Yeah. So, if you had any advice for someone who's listening that perhaps want to write a cookbook of their own or find an agent or a publisher, what would you tell them?
Um, I think really important would be to create a very comprehensive proposal really think about what your mission is in the cookbook. And then, create some of the recipes, some of the things that you actually want to show them. Maybe take some photographs, even if you're going to have a photographer for your cookbook, just giving them an idea, something that they can look at. I would say 10, maybe 10 recipes, at least, and showing them what you're able to do, and showing them a good amount of your writing style, a good chunk of it. And then also trying to write in publications. I wrote a lot of articles for different magazines and things like that.
Yeah.
Over
Something about your book, I can see why the photos would be so helpful to a publisher to really get you can't describe the depth of the color in a lot
Yeah.
of these recipes. You have to see it to believe it.
Yeah.
And I would think that that alone would pique their curiosity. So a lot of times proposals don't all like if you're I don't know what you might even write about, but not always photography, especially since, like you said, you're not pitching yourself as the photographer.
Right. Right.
But if the photo can capture the essence of what you're doing, like yours did with the depth of this color, I think it probably is essential. Because I don't know how else you would have communicated it.
Yeah. I don't
Like
either.
close your eyes and imagine a really deep
Yeah.
green donut.
Yeah.
No, darker than that. And then you're
Yeah.
like,
That's
okay,
right. You're
I'm
almost
not
there.
exactly. I'm not really sure that I got them to think about the kind of green because if you guys get your hands on the book, you will see what I mean. I mean, it is like the color in a lot of the dishes is just amazing. And I think you start to think, is that really food? Is that possible to make that green? The lemon balm and lime curd thumbprint cookies, also very beautiful uh,
Mm.
in the color that you used in them, amazing. So I've been captivated by the liquid chlorophyll and the spruce pops also. They're in the spring chapter, but that's fascinating also to have that depth of color in a popsicle.
Yes, and that is also using the chlorophyll.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
So something this is a little bit of a personal interest of mine, but something I think a lot of people like to hear from or people I interview. When we're writing books, it's kind of consuming. Like we're cooking a lot, we're writing a lot. Sometimes we're doing things over and over again. But I love to hear about if you had any rituals that helped you during your even with working and writing. What it is that kind of keeps you connected to who you are and the spirit of the work that you do.
Yes, there's a few things. Well, when I was writing the book, I had to get up very early in the morning. That was kind of the way that I had to start every day. Before everyone, I have a little girl and she was going to school. My husband is a farmer. It was a busy
Yeah.
time. Plus, I have a full-time job. So I would get up pretty early in the morning. I would say like 4:30, 4 in the morning, and make a fire. I did a lot of writing in the fall and winter. I would make a fire, drink tea, and just settle in and just write, even if nothing was coming out that made sense. I would be writing for an hour pretty much every morning at least. And that's where I got most of the book done. That's when I'm like the freshest. So I would say whenever you're the freshest, that's the best time to write. Some people are night owls, but I'm all morning. It's all happening before noon for me.
Yeah.
Um, and
And I think
yeah,
that's important is that people do have different times when they're the most uh, their mind is fresh, they're available to write. Doesn't
right.
have to be the morning, but what I loved about what you said is that you committed to doing it every day. And I think that people say, "Well, I don't know if I can do it every day," but I say, "Well, sometimes committing to every day actually makes things easier, believe it or not, because there's no chatter in your mind about it.
Exactly.
This
And
is
that
just what I do."
right, this is what I do. And then even if it's not necessarily a successful session, you you can usually glean something good from
Oh,
from
100 I agree with you
you know.
completely. Right, right.
So it's worth doing. And,
I
I,
think what makes it successful is the fact that you did it.
yes.
And like you said, there may be a few sentences, but I bet a lot of times it was more material than just a few things that you probably could end up using.
Right. It's ideas. It's like I feel like you have an idea and then it's like all just you keep narrowing it down, bringing making it more concise, especially I went way over my word count, so I had to, kind of carve things down.
That's always so hard to do.
Hard. I know, like, there's a whole other book in there, so
Yeah, yeah. Well,
but
that's possible also. They gave you a word count in addition to the number of recipes, or was the recipes part of the word count?
yeah, they no, because I also have in the book, it's the essential plant glossary, and that's more where I do a lot of writing. I mean, I write in the recipes as well, but that was kind of something I really wanted in there. It has about 30 plants that I talk about before the recipes are even, and then there's
Yeah,
100 recipes. So
yeah.
that's kind of an unusual thing
So
for a
they
book.
gave you a word count then for the written part prior to the recipes.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there might be another book in it, and uh, I do you stay true to that ritual outside of your book writing project?
I do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
too. Yeah,
It's necessary for me. I've kind of, I've always been a writer, and I love writing. So even if I'm not writing for a specific project, I'm writing for myself.
yep,
And that informs everything else I do, and it always has. So I was also, I mean, I went to college for painting. I was a teacher yeah, I had a whole other life before this project too. And I still always had writing as one of the main focuses in my life. So the paintings would be informed by the writing, it's all, it just has to be there. We have
yeah,
to have
right.
writing,
And I
you know.
love that you did this in the midst of having children,
Yeah.
having a full-time job.
Yeah. I
Uh,
say it's my second baby actually because
exactly. But the thing about a baby is we're not pregnant like all the time.
yeah, it's true.
So it's fine. It's a finite amount of time that we invest in the growing of this book.
Yes.
And then you have this beautiful book now you get to go on podcasts and go out and talk about and share with people, and people are buying it. But the I just think that if it's a topic that we're close to and that we have lived and we believe in, if we carve out the space to write about it, the book will come because it's something that we know inside out and upside down, and we want to talk about it and we want to write about it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, we want to share it.
we do. Right. So I think that it's beautiful that you still keep that ritual, and I think that it's very for me mentally clarifying to write every day. Um,
Yes.
and I try to keep my pen moving. Sometimes I'm like, "What?" I may think to myself, "Well, I don't know what to write about now." So I don't really allow that. I just start to describe whatever is in the room I'm sitting in, and I
Yes.
try to distract my brain from the thought, "I don't know what to write about," because there's like a million things I could write about.
Right. Yes. Oftentimes I'll do that. And I'll just write about, what did I dream about last night? What's happening right now? Exactly. Like the sun is rising. Oh, there's this thing, it's just,
Yes. Yes. Julia Cameron she wrote The Artist's Way, but she also wrote a book. The Artist's Way was a book about creativity, but she wrote a book about writing, and she said that when she sat down to write, she always started with what she called the flora and fauna report.
oh, I love
I
that.
do too. So this would not be like it could be her sitting indoors. I think she lived in New Mexico, looking like at a mountain. She could describe what's going on outside. She could describe but sometimes she would purposefully change her writing location, so she was either sitting in her yard or near her yard so she could talk about the birds, she could talk about bugs she saw, but she called it her flora and fauna report, and that was always the way to get her brain like, "Okay, it's time to get going. We're gonna start writing now." And she said she always did that. The other thing she talked about a lot was her little dog loved to steal her pen. So she would come back to the writing and say, "Well, I just got up to get a cup of tea, and of course," I can't remember the dog's name. "Of
Yeah.
course, so and so stole my pen, and I had to chase him around the room for a while." So it was just very interesting listening. And this probably had nothing at all to do with her book, yet it did, because she used it as part of the book to give examples to people of what you can write about.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, it was. It was great. People will say, "Well, I get stuck. I don't know what to write." And she says, just sit down. Doesn't have to be an expensive notebook, and just start writing about what you see. What's going
Exactly.
on around you. Yeah.
Well, an observation is one of the biggest things in creativity. If you can observe something, then so much beauty and so much information can come just from that one little place that you're observing.
Yeah. And I
I
think that you have just almost tied this conversation up beautifully, because isn't foraging and herbs and growing things about observing it and like picking it and bringing it into your kitchen when it's
Yeah, I was
ready
gonna
ready
say
to use?
I definitely talk about doing that in the book. So
Yeah, yeah. Because some
it's
things you may think, "Oh, it's almost ready to pick, but I'm gonna wait just a little bit longer." Or, "I gotta wait for the rose hip." Like, the rose hip's not there yet. It's time we'll pick the rose hip when it's there.
yeah.
Yeah,
And I think it's also observation, in regards to foraging or just getting to know where you live in general. Like the plants where you live. I mean,
yeah.
so in the book, I actually talk about just observe like a 4 by 4, like 4 foot by 4 foot space.
Mhm.
Do it just on your morning walk. Even if you're in New York City, there's like a million plants there. I was on a trip in Portland a couple months ago, and just walking down the street, I mean, Colorado, when it gets cold here, every single thing dies. And it's dry as a bone, and there's no little things blooming or growing. So going to Portland and seeing all the flowers, St. John's wort growing up through the sidewalk next to mallow, next to, like, it was incredible, plants everywhere just in the middle of the city. So if that was my morning walk every day, I would start like going, okay, so that's blooming now. And I do that in my observations that I either write down. I know when all the violets are going to come up. I take a walk around just my little yard, and I know the violets are coming up soon. The leaves have already emerged. It might snow like for 2 more months, but they're coming now.
Yeah,
I know. you
yeah.
know,
I bet
I
that's
know.
wonderful, and I bet, documenting that and keeping track of that is just like that's, like, totally up my alley. I love doing stuff like that, because there is seasonality to the way
Yes,
things grow and emerge, and it might not be the exact same day every year, but there's a rhythm to it.
there is.
Yeah.
And
Do you know what gardening zone you're in Colorado? I'm just curious for, those of us that live in different parts of the country.
yeah, I'm in 5.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. I can even see cross sections of this book related to different gardening zones.
Yes, and I spend time in Ireland
Yeah.
every year, and so there's some plants that I reference that are in Ireland, so places that would be maybe a more temperate location than Colorado. But for the most part, um I just try to make the book as kind of accessible and applicable to everywhere as possible,
Yeah.
um, while still touching in on some really interesting and fun plants, that people might not think of or maybe they haven't heard of. But
Yeah, and with the swaps, you certainly made that even took that one step further, so,
yes,
it's a beautiful book, and I hope whether people forage or not, they, um, get a copy and look at
thank-
the color and read all about, the lovely things that we're making, everything from creamy nettle and lemon balm hummus to, cucamelon and purslane salad with wildflowers, just makes me wanna go out and chop things down and bring them in my kitchen and cook with them. It's just amazing. So really, really fun. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And something that I like to ask my cookbook authors as I'm wrapping up is about your favorite cookbooks. I know we write cookbooks, but I bet there's some that are near and dear to your heart. So do you have any favorite cookbooks and what they are and why?
I do. Well, I have a huge collection of cookbooks, I should say, first off.
Good, you belong here.
Yes, I have read cookbooks as if they were novels since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And so two of my favorite cookbooks are both from my childhood. One is my grandmother's cookbook. And it's a very old book that she collected, little cutout recipes or recipes that she typed on her typewriter, with all her notes and, really simple, straightforward recipes. And I just love them all. I love them,
Yeah.
And then the other one is Madur Jaffery's World of the East Vegetarian Cooking. And it's a book that was on my parents' bookshelf when I was a kid. And even though I don't think they ever cooked a recipe from it, which is why I have it now, because I was like, well, I'm taking this with me when I moved out. But I loved to read it when I was a kid. I just thought, what are these spices? Like, what? And I was so drawn to Indian spices and cooking, and I still am. It's still one of my favorite cuisines in the world. Like, I think it's an incredible blend of spices and herbs and balance. And yeah, I just love it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, great. I'll link to Madur Jaffery's book in the show notes, and I won't be able to link to your grandmother's, but I think it's special to have recipes like that and have things that people typed or wrote in their own handwriting, and especially someone like your grandmother who inspired you so much in the work that you do.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Julia Child, of course. Probably goes without saying for most.
Right. It's also good for those of us who collect cookbooks to hear someone say, well, I've got a book on my shelf, but I've never cooked out of it. I've just read it. And that is true, I think, for a lot of us. This genre of book does something special to our life. It provides us, opportunities to travel places we've never been, read ways of cooking that we haven't experienced before, read the same types of dishes prepared in different kitchens and the way they describe things. So it's just so much fun. And of course, obviously, the whole reason why I decided to have a podcast about cookbooks. My sisters would say, my mom, what's it going to be about? I said, we're going to talk about cookbooks. People that love to read, write, and collect cookbooks.
I love it. It's like my dream.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes. Well, your book is beautiful. I wish you nothing but the best while you're out and about and online talking about your book and all the wonderful work you do. But why don't you tell everybody how they can connect with you online?
Sure. So I'm on Instagram at The Medicine Circle, and it's all one word. And then also on Facebook. I have a website called themedicincircle.com, and those are the main ways.
Great. I'll link to all those in the show notes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Tara, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and
thank
sharing
you.
all your wisdom with us. And again, have a great time with your new book, and maybe we'll meet again someday over some delicious, colorful food with foraged and grown ingredients.
Yay! I would love that.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. Again, all the links can be found in the show notes at www.cookbooklove.co. And if you are interested in writing a cookbook of your own, please check out the free cookbook writing masterclass called How to Get Paid to Write a Cookbook. It is designed specifically for food or nutrition experts, and you can check that out at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. So that's it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green. And until next time, have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.